Scripture that I have for you this morning is from 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 15 to 19. 3 of the 30 chiefs went down to the rock to David at the cave of Adullam, while the army of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, the well that is by the gate." Then the three broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate. And they brought it to David. But David would not drink of it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, "My God forbid that I should do this. Can I drink the blood of these men?" For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore he would not drink it. The three warriors did these things.
The tank busters, 351s. Hands on our shoulders. What, sir?
Recognize that that is probably one of the most moving scenes from Saving Private Ryan. Earn this. Memorial Day is a day in which we honor those who have fallen in battle, who have given the ultimate sacrifice so that we might know and enjoy freedom and liberty. It's also become a time in which we remember not just fallen heroes who had their lives cut short because they defended the cause of justice, but also a time of remembering and honoring loved ones who have gone on before us and now reside in the communion of saints in the heavenly home. It is a time in which we reflect. We are meant to ask ourselves, how are our lives different as a result of the living and sacrifices of those close to us and those who have sacrificed everything throughout history for the ideals of justice and freedom and liberty? How do we honor such devotion and sacrifice? How do we earn this loyalty and sacrifice of loved ones and fallen heroes and heroines? It's part of what the writer of 1 Chronicles is struggling with. It's kind of this obscure little story about King David. He is now king, just newly appointed king. And the Philistines have overrun the promised land. And they're occupying a great deal of the land that has been promised them by God, including King David's hometown, Bethlehem. And David, almost as if thinking out loud, he says, "Oh, how good it would be to have the sweet water of my birth, the delightful memories of Bethlehem, my good times there, they haunt me in these troubled times." And three of his mighty warriors, hearing the musing of David, decide that they need to obey the king and give him a treat. And at the risk of their own lives, they execute this kind of commando raid. And they infiltrate the Philistine lines and get into Bethlehem and bring back water for David to drink. And David is struck, not by just their bravery and their skill, but also by their loyalty and their commitment to him as their king. And the gift offered is too much. And he cannot bring himself to drink the water brought at such risk and bravado. And so he pours it out on the ground, not as any sign of disrespect, but rather as a sign of high praise, an offering to the Lord. An offering as an act of praise and devotion to the Lord, and for his men for such bravery and commitment. I'm a student of history, especially American history. I was the kid in class that whenever they divided up the history class that, have competition, everybody wanted me on their side. I actually found a mistake in my sophomore history book. Everybody groaned. But I've been impressed and fascinated by the ingenuity and the bravery of the human spirit that has made possible this nation that we so enjoy. It is a nation that is committed to the causes of justice and freedom. And we have not always been true to those principles. But do you realize that even when we have failed in upholding those principles, we have written our history in such a way as to not to cover up those mistakes, but rather to air them openly so that we will learn from those mistakes and hopefully not repeat them. When I consider the task of earning what has been handed to us, of honoring the sacrifices of the men and women who have fallen in battle securing the principles that this nation holds so dear, I cannot help but think of the speech penned by Abraham Lincoln, a speech in which he also was struggling with the idea of honoring ultimate sacrifices. And of course, I speak of the Gettysburg Address. Almost every year, Memorial Day, I go and I read it. It's readily available on the internet now. Thank you, Bill Gates. It's only 6 sentences long. Probably one of the most moving speeches ever penned. Abraham Lincoln, there are 3 prominent thoughts in the Gettysburg Address. First is the appreciation for our great heritage. He writes, "Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The land which our fathers of our nations bequeath to us is a land of liberty and equality." That was their vision, that's their dream. The flag that is lit over our nation is a flag that stands for freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship. It represents the right of every citizen to enjoy these freedoms and an equal opportunity to make the most of their God-given capabilities. The fathers accepted this liberty and equality as a sacred trust from the hand of God. And we were taught to praise that power that has made and preserved this nation. Are we worthy heirs of such riches? Do we prize them as highly as we ought to, thanking God for them as much as we ought to? Do we appreciate the high privilege of American citizenship? Do we make responsible and constructive use of our citizenship? We Americans of the 21st century, we tend to take our freedoms for granted. We need to recover the reverent appreciation that our forefathers and Lincoln had. As I think about the Declaration of Independence and those people who risked everything for the developing of our nations, I think of what they sacrificed. It's interesting when you go back and you look at the signers of the Constitution and the delegates of the First Continental Congress, some of that which they sacrificed a great deal. Francis Lewis was a New York delegate, and his home was plundered in what is now Harlem, completely destroyed by British soldiers. His wife, Mrs. Lewis, was captured and suffered great brutality. And even though later she was exchanged for 2 British prisoners, she died because of her abuse at the hands of British soldiers. William Floyd was another New York delegate, and he was able to escape with his wife and children across Long Island. He made it to Connecticut, where they lived as refugees throughout the rest of the 7 years of the Revolution. When they came back to their home, it had been completely destroyed. Philip Livingstone had all of his holdings in New York confiscated, and his family was driven out of their home. Livingstone died in 1778, still working in Congress for the cause. Lewis Morris, the fourth New York delegate, saw all of his timber, crops, and livestock taken, and for 7 years he was barred from his home and his family. John Hart was from Trenton, New Jersey, and he risked his life to return home. He wanted to see his dying wife. Hessian soldiers rode after him the whole way. He escaped into the woods. While his wife lay on her deathbed, the soldiers ruined his farm and wrecked his homestead. Hart, at the age of 65, slept in caves and woods, and he was hunted across the countryside. When at long last, emaciated by his hardship, he was able to come back home, he found that his wife had already died and she had been buried, and his 13 children taken away. And he never saw them again. He died a broken man in 1779, never finding his family. Dr. John Witherspoon was president of the College of New Jersey that later became Princeton. And the British occupied Princeton, and they billeted their troops in his college. And they trampled and burned what was then the finest college in all of the colonies. Judge Richard Stockton was another New Jersey delegate, and he rushed back to his estate in an effort to evacuate his wife and his children. And the family found refuge with friends, but sympathizers then betrayed him. When Judge Stockton was pulled from his bed in the night and brutally beaten by the arresting soldiers. He was thrown into a common jail, and he was deliberately starved. Congress finally arranged for his parole, but his health was ruined. He was released as an invalid. He could no longer harm the British cause. He returned to his home. He found his estates looted, and he died shortly thereafter, not living to see the triumph of the Revolution. His family was forced to live on charity for the rest of their lives. The second thought that Lincoln has in his speech is an acknowledgement of what has been paid for our heritage. He wrote, "We remember those who gave their last full measure of devotion, who gave their lives that this nation might live." Memorial Day calls us to pay respect to the brave men and women, living and dead, who have fought to preserve this nation. But in doing so, we are compelled to count the cost of that heritage in terms of lives of fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, in terms of widows and orphans. On the long run, we appreciate most the things that have been purchased at a high price. In our American way of living, our lives have been purchased at a very high price. Today is a day in which we take an opportunity to pause and say thank you to men and women who paid the ultimate price. There's also a time, though, when we ought to reflect on those who were able to return. Having placed their lives in jeopardy, many of them walk around with invisible scars. In World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, they called it battle fatigue. Now we call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it is a very, very real burden that they bear. I have a friend who's a general surgeon up in Toledo. John Wright is his name. Several years ago, it was around Memorial Day, we were talking about our fathers, and his father served, and my father served during World War II. And John relayed this story to me.